The Labour government's decision to cut winter fuel payments has left millions of pensioners across the UK struggling to stay warm. Now, many are facing an agonising choice: heat their homes or put food on the table. In the midst of this growing crisis, Conservative MP Nick Timothy took a stand. During a fiery debate in Westminster Hall, he called out the government's actions and demanded accountability. Watch as he exposes the real impact of these cuts and challenges Labour to answer for their decisions.
As the member for Poole said, we cannot ignore the hardship caused by the government's decision to cut the winter fuel payment so aggressively for millions of pensioners. Of course, there's a case for means testing the payment, but the Chancellor is cutting it, not just for the richest pensioners, but for those on very modest incomes. And if the winter fuel payment is to be means tested, surely the proceeds should go towards low-income pensioners and the cost of social care. But they're not, because we know Labour's spending priorities. It's to throw money they're taking from pensioners to the public sector and railway unions that funded them. Let us remember, during the election campaign, Labour repeatedly promised us that they would protect the winter fuel payment. But we know the Chancellor planned the cut all along, because she said she wanted to do this as far back as 2014. And let us be clear, as my honourable friend, the member for Keighley and Ilkley said, the policy is a political choice, not, as ministers claim, an economic necessity. The Office for Budget Responsibility has blown up the government's claim that it inherited a fiscal hole. Of the report used by ministers to justify this claim, Richard Hughes, the OBR chairman, said, quotes, "Nothing in our review was a legitimisation of that claim." And indeed, the minister with us today must answer this simple question. If the cuts for pensioners and the tax rises were made necessary by fiscal prudence, why did Labour promise in their manifesto to increase spending by £9.5 billion a year by 2028-29, only to actually increase it in their budget by £76 billion? This was a choice. But of course, the challenge of fuel poverty affects people of all ages and across the country. Rather than creating new benefits and schemes to address the high cost of fuel, we need also to resolve the root causes of energy costs more generally. And here the government is taking the country in a very worrying direction. The Energy Secretary promises to decarbonise the grid by 2030. The Business Secretary wants to ban petrol and diesel cars by the same year. Tough standards on aviation fuel are being enforced. Heat pumps are expected to replace gas boilers. Expensive and intermittent renewable technologies funded with huge and hidden subsidies are favoured. Oil and gas fields in the North Sea are abandoned, left for the Norwegians to profit from what we choose to ignore. The Energy Secretary has made much of the NISO report on decarbonising the grid. He says it shows that he can do that by 2030 without increasing bills. But in fact, the report doesn't say that. And even then, its calculations rest on a carbon price that will rise to £147 per tonne of CO2. No wonder, in reply to a question I asked him last week, the Energy Secretary wouldn't rule out having a higher carbon price in Britain than in Europe. This will be terrible for families struggling with the cost of heating their homes, but it will hurt them and indeed all of us in other ways. As long as policy runs faster than technology and other countries do not follow our lead on climate change, decarbonisation will inevitably mean deindustrialisation. And that will mean a weaker economy with lower growth, fewer jobs and less spending power to help those we've been discussing today who need support the most. And of course, it's not just the NISO report that shows us the future consequences of the government's policies. The OBR says environmental levies will reach up to £15 billion by the end of this Parliament to pay for net zero policies. As this will fall heavily on consumption, it will have a particularly regressive effect. Analysis from the Institute for Fiscal Studies and from Cornwall Insight confirm this fact. No wonder, then, that the Labour election promise to cut bills by £300 by the end of the Parliament has vanished without trace. So I challenge the Minister today to do what she hasn't done since polling day and repeat that promise very clearly. I suspect she won't, because unlike the Secretary of State, she knows the reality of his policies. The government is adding complexity and contradiction to our energy system, It's loading extra costs onto families across the country. There is still time for ministers to think again and put the interests of decent, hard-working people ahead of the Energy Secretary's ideological dogma.
Do you think this Labour government is the worst in UK history? Their decisions have left millions struggling, and the impact is being felt nationwide. If you agree, show your support by liking this video, and don't hold back, drop your thoughts in the comments below. Let's get the conversation going.